Good evening, everyone. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to the second session of O.T.O 101. The religious philosophy which animates all of the work of Ordo Templi Orientis is called Thelema. Tonight's talk attempts to answer the question, what is Thelema? What I am about to say about Thelema does not represent official O.T.O doctrine. As far as I know, O.T.O does not have an official interpretation of Thelema. And while I am giving this talk on behalf of Horizon Lodge O.T.O, I do not speak on behalf of any particular individual member of Horizon other than, of course, myself. That being said, I believe what I am about to say is consistent with how Aleister Crowley understood Thelema, and my hope is that it is both comprehensible and valuable to you. Thelema is the Greek word for will. The phrase with which I opened this talk, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, is widely regarded as a summary statement of Thelema. Adherents to Thelema are called Thelemites. They typically greet one another in written and verbal communications by saying, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Sometimes they abbreviate this as 93. 93 is the enumeration of the Greek word thelema when we represent each letter with a number by a system of counting called isopsephy. 93 is also the enumeration of another Greek word, agape, which means love. Along with do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, a second complementary summary statement of Thelema is love is the law, love under will. So in response to hearing do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, Thelemites often reply with love is the law, love under will. Or sometimes they will say 93, 93, 93, or just 93s. It is a typical thelemic form of greeting. Thelema can be tricky to define. It's actually difficult even saying what sort of thing thelema is. How do we categorize it? There were times when Crowley described it as a religion, and then there were times he emphatically said it was not a religion. This is not as contradictory as it sounds. Even in Crowley's time, religion had come to represent the ossified accretions of superstition. By contrast, writing in the wake of Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God, Crowley's intentions were modernistic and iconoclastic. On the other hand, consider the etymology of religion. It comes from Latin religio, which means obligation, bond, or reverence. And the verb religare, which means to bind. You're going to find out shortly why I think binding and hence religion are actually quite apt to describe Thelema. Especially in the context of O.T.O, Thelema shows itself also to be a philosophy. The emphasis of O.T.O's teachings is on cosmology, ethics, and how they inform our path through life. This is not philosophy as a detached academic subject of interest solely to intellectual specialists. It's closer to what Pierre Hadot has called philosophy as a way of life. In other words, it's more like ancient Stoicism or Neoplatonism than it is like contemporary academic philosophy. At the risk of oversimplifying, the core subject matter of Thelema is identical with the core subject matter of religion in its deepest sense. I hope to show you why I think that this evening. One important difference between Thelema and other religions is that Thelemic creeds or doctrines are not the essence of Thelema. Our holy texts, one of which I will discuss tonight, are not sets of factually true propositions or beliefs about the world. We don't read our holy books to get the kind of information we'd get from reading the New York Times, a textbook on quantum mechanics, or an Emily Post guide on etiquette. By contrast, our doctrines are meant to provoke us into an awareness of the sacred depths of ourselves and of the world we live in. In other words, the depths of Thelema are esoteric. Thelema is intended to lead you to an experience of self-transcendence which shatters illusions about self and world. The goal of Thelema isn't to give you more information about the world or even about yourself, although in some ways it does do that. The point of Thelema is to radically transform your relationship with yourself and the world. That makes it more like Gnosticism or Buddhism than, for example, mainstream Protestantism. So instead of pretending to explain the entirety of Thelema to you tonight, which I doubt anyone could do, what I'm going to do instead is drill down into one aspect of Thelema, which I think is central to it, which I think is relatively easy to understand, which pulls together lots of different threads of Thelema, and which has a large number of implications for the cultivation of meaning and spiritual practice. And this is the idea of what Aleister Crowley thought the human being is. In short, he said, every man and every woman is a star. In order to understand how Crowley understood the human being, let's consider the foundational text of Thelema, the Book of the Law. The Book of the Law, also known by its Latin title, Liber L vel Legis sub figura 220, is a short book of 220 verses. Crowley claimed it was dictated to him in Cairo, Egypt in 1904 by a disembodied spiritual being that called itself Aiwass. The Book of the Law is the source of the phrases, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and love is the law, love under will. In his 1938 introduction to the Book of the Law, Aleister Crowley said that the Book of the Law explains the universe. It describes how the reality we live in is constituted. He said the world is composed of two elements. There is space and the matter occupying it, what we might call nature or the sum total of possibilities, and there's any viewpoint on nature. These two principles are symbolized in the book by two deities that appear on the funerary stele of Ankh-Afnakansu, a priest of the Egyptian god Mentu who lived in Thebes around 725 BCE. The first is symbolized by the Egyptian sky goddess Nuit, and the second by the winged solar disk, Hadit. Why Egyptian deities? Does this mean that Thelema is a form of Egyptian religious revival? In short, no. There are historical reasons that the ideas are represented using these two deities. There's also a third deity, Ra-Hoor-Khuit, who I will talk about shortly. Ultimately, Crowley described these Egyptian deities as literary conveniences. He says at one point that Shiva and Shakti are roughly equivalent terms, and he often describes them using non-theological language. I will follow a similar practice this evening, drawing parallels with accepted science and common experiences. So try not to get too distracted by the use of Egyptian names. There's more here than a rehash of Egyptian polytheism. Crowley goes on to say that every event, in other words, every change, is a uniting of Hadit with one of the experiences possible to it. In other words, some aspect of Nuit. Each person, he says, is defined as an aggregate of such experiences, constantly changing with each fresh event, which affects him or her either consciously or subconsciously. This flow of experiences, which makes up the essence of each person, is what Crowley called the star. After the third verse of the first chapter of the Book of the Law, which reads, "Every man and every woman is a star." This is the main idea I'd like to explain to you tonight. According to Crowley, the human being is not a simple entity, nor is it just an animal with a spirit stuffed into it. A human being is the product of the interaction between two fundamental divine principles or forces. There's the active masculine principle, hadit. This is the pure desire to be or to become of any living being. An otherwise healthy, thriving, living being doesn't just decide one day that, hey, I've had enough of living and experiencing, so I'm just going to sit down here and just wait for death to set in. In other words, our will to be is open-ended and has no final purpose. On the other hand, there's the feminine constraining principle, Nuit. Sometimes Nuit and feminine magical principles in general are described as passive. I don't think that's quite accurate. The contrast Crowley draws in the introduction to the Book of the Law is not between active and passive. It's between events and possibilities. Hadit's actions are events that bring about other events. Hadit's will to be or to become is causing change. Nuit is constraining those changes by setting conditions. Conditions do not cause events to take place. Conditions make things possible. This might be easier to understand by drawing an analogy here with Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution operates on the basis of two principles, variation and selection. Even within a species, not all individuals look the same. There is variation amongst them. Variation opens up the options for a species. But you have a counterbalancing principle, that of selection, which reduces options for a species. These are things like scarcity of resources and competition. It's the interaction between these two principles which drives evolution. Selecting for better fittedness to the environment drives the dynamic change of species over time. The interaction between Hadit and Nuit that defines the individual human being is analogous to Darwinian evolution. It's a dynamical interaction which drives the change of the individual over time. The core drive of the individual to be, to express itself in its environment, is what Crowley calls will. Nuit is the context or environment in which that will expresses itself and which constrains the expression of that will in various ways. The participation between the individual and the environment which results is what Crowley calls love. To work with that relationship so as to optimize the fittedness, if you'll allow me the analogy again with Darwin, between Hadit within and Nuit without, so that there is continual development and constant growth, is what Crowley calls love under will or magick. This is the key idea I want to impart to you tonight. So let me say it again, a little differently, and I'll leave the diagram up so you can take some time to think about this. deep inside of you, below the level of your conscious self, below the level of your freedom of choice and your sense of who you are, there is a primordial impulse or urge to be, to become, to go. In and of itself, it has no particular reason, aim, or purpose other than to become. This is what Crowley calls hadit. The action of hadit is called the will. The Greek word for will is thelema. But that core will expresses itself in an environment which constrains it in various ways. That environment, which is space and the matter in it, is called nuit. Nuit constrains the activities of hadit. Constraints are not the same thing as restrictions. Not all constraints are restrictions. Some of them also create possibilities. For instance, a bird flying through a strong headwind might be led to believe its flight would be easier if it encountered no air resistance. But if that were the case, it would just fall to the ground. This is why Crowley says that nuit is the sum total of all possibilities. In contrast with hadit, who makes events occur, nuit makes things possible by constraining events in various ways. Who and what you are as an individual is the product of the interaction between these two principles. Your physical body, your personality, your mind, your intellect, your memory, your imagination, and your sense of agency are all the results of the constant, passionate, ongoing interactions between nuit and hadit, an interaction which Crowley calls love. To put an even finer point on this, you are not nuit. You are not hadit. You are nuit and hadit conjoined. Every man and every woman is a star. When we self-consciously work to affect a more optimal relationship between the hadit within and the nuit without, in other words, when we are affecting a stronger connection between the depths of ourselves and the depths of reality, that is called love under will or magic. So will is the core drive to become. Love is the result of that drive expressing itself in an environment. Love under will is when we consciously optimize the relationship between the core of ourselves and our environment. The result is that we experience constant, dynamic, continual, open-ended growth. Our moral and spiritual powers increase. We experience more joy and meaning in life. Let's consider some of the implications. First, the deepest part of yourself strives to have contact with the deepest part of reality. Leaving a thelema aside for a moment, don't we just know that something like this has to be true? Many of the most satisfying experiences in life follow this or a similar pattern. Think of what it's like when you're in the zone, like when you're acquiring a new set of skills. The demands of the environment are just beyond what your current skill set is. So you have to put everything you've got into the task. Your sense of self changes. You lose your sense of self-consciousness and self-image management. There's a very tight connection or fittedness between yourself and your environment. This is an intrinsically satisfying, universal, cross-cultural state. Think about the experience of appreciating natural beauty. It's as though a mind like yours created nature for a mind like yours. Or think about the way you can get deeply absorbed in a compelling novel or a film. Or if you're an artist, musician, writer, or other kind of creator, think about the deep connection you feel between the deepest part of yourself and reality when you're making music, painting, or writing. And think about the frustration that arises when that impulse is blocked and you can't create. Think about what it's like to fall in love. You're revealing depths of yourself to another person while they're doing the same with you. There is mutual accelerating disclosure. It's not an accident that Crowley used the term love to describe the relationship I'm talking about. Second, notice how this emphasis on connection, or what Crowley calls love, harkens back to the original meaning of religion as binding or connecting, especially connecting with sacredness in a reverential way. The goal of Thelema is the deepening of a kind of connection which we're already familiar with in our everyday lives. When this connection is very deep, when our sense of oneness with reality is pushed to the extreme. Isn't that generally how people describe religious or mystical experiences? I'll return to this in a moment. Third, notice how the focus of Thelema is not on a particular object or outcome, but rather on a process, what Crowley calls love under will. Love relationships don't have a particular object either. They're open-ended. When do you stop working on your love relationship? Well, around the time that it ends, probably. Love does not have any final form. Crowley said, the joy of life consists in the exercise of one's energies, continual growth, constant change, the enjoyment of every new experience. To stop means simply to die. The eternal mistake of mankind is to set up an attainable ideal. This isn't simply romanticism. Other religions set up a narrative ideal of what a person should be like. We've all heard the expression before, what would Jesus do? It's become a cliche. There is a Jesus-like figure in Thelema, and that is Horus, a third figure after Nuit and Hadit depicted on the stele of Ankh na Khonsu. He's known by a few other names, including Ra-Hoor-Khuit in the Book of the Law. At the risk of oversimplifying and maybe even ruffling some feathers, no pun intended, Horus is to Thelema what Christ is to Christianity. Now, this is not an invitation to grow a beak and pluck out your eye and smite your enemies. The ideal represented by Horus is that of continual growth. In other words, open-ended development. Again, the analogy with evolution is apt. There's no such thing as a finished form of an alligator, let alone of a human being. Species are constantly changing as a result of the dynamic interaction between variation and selection. Thelema is the same outlook applied to the individual in their moral and spiritual development. Fourth, it would be wrong to think of ourselves as detached observers of experience. We're not disembodied minds looking out at the world from behind our eyes. Our fundamental way of relating to the world is participatory. When people attend Gnostic Mass for the first time at Horizon, we tell them the Mass is a participatory ritual, meaning there are parts where the congregants have to follow along and perform certain actions. Life is a participatory ritual. We're caught up in things in a way which is engaged and engaging and reciprocal. We're not standing outside the world, looking in and thinking about it. We're in the world, spatially, of course, but more importantly, we're in the world in the way someone is in college, or in the army, or in love, or playing in a soccer match. We're caught up in it. The conscious intellectual mind does not create that relationship or that connection with the world, although it can reflect and get clearer about it. Fifth, it would be equally wrong to think of ourselves as detached doers or manipulators. We're not making decisions or initiating courses of action from a place outside of the universe. We're not simply imposing our wills on reality. Our sense of agency or freedom depends upon a more basic coupling within us of divine forces, which is self-organizing and self-driven. It's the fittedness, or lack thereof, between these two principles which is responsible for our sense of our own power. Incidentally, this is one of the functions of ceremonial magic and spiritual practices more generally. It allows us to interact with these underlying processes by means of symbols. This leads into the sixth implication, which has to do with the self-conscious working with the relationship between these two divine principles by means of magic. Magic in the Thelemic sense includes ceremonial magic, but is more general than it. It has to do more generally with conditioning the body and the mind so that they more adequately enable the loving interaction between the hadith within and the nuit without. As I said, love under will is a synonym Crowley used for this conscious relationship to how these two principles relate within us. And this is why Crowley said that 90% of Thelema is self-discipline. Self-discipline is when we deliberately work with constraints to complexify ourselves and increase our powers. O.T.O, especially the introductory degrees, known as the Man of Earth degrees, provides a course of training in this kind of optimizing self-discipline. As Kellen pointed out in the last class, one of Crowley's intentions with the Man of Earth initiations was to teach certain virtues, such as discretion, truthfulness, courage, independence, and so forth. One of the classic ways to understand a virtue is as a mean between extremes. For instance, in O.T.O, we value honesty and forthrightness, but they can be taken to extremes. For example, if someone here asked me what happens in the third degree initiation of O.T.O, it would certainly be honest of me to tell them, but I would also be breaking my oath. So the mean between dishonesty and extreme forthrightness would be discretion. Likewise, the mean between rashness and cowardice is courage. Between extreme individualism and dependence, you get loyalty. To return to our helpful Darwinian analogy, with a virtue, we're looking to attain the proper balance in the moment between variation and selection, between opening options and closing them off. Exactly what virtue we apply in any moment and how we apply it depends upon what will achieve the optimal relationship between our respective wills and the environment. Hence, the supreme principle in Thelema, which guides all moral and spiritual development, and hence any practice of any virtue, is do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. In other words, Thelemic ethics is not abstract and universal, but is meant to support and enable the dynamic interaction between the god within and the goddess without. This is always going to be relative to the individual and the situation they find themselves in. When you develop these virtues, you're optimizing the relationship between yourself and your environment, but you're also optimizing your relationship for yourself with yourself. This is what's called developing character. Developing character is the O.T.O method of disciplining the body and mind to express love under will. One of Crowley's really interesting insights was to recognize how important higher states of consciousness are to this fittedness between ourselves and the world. Remember when I was talking about states of flow and being in the zone, like when we're learning skills, appreciating beauty, creating art, or falling in love. Mystical states are the extreme version of these. Mystical experiences heighten our sense of participation in the depths of reality. Paradoxically, they also decenter us. They humiliate us. They make us realize we're not the center of things. They give us insight into our nature and nature generally, so that we see that what we call ourselves is part of and dependent upon something much larger. That's the deep meaning of true will. The development of higher states of consciousness is not the focus of O.T.O's teachings. This is an extremely simplified outline of what O.T.O teaches in its introductory degrees. First degree kind of has to do with disciplining the body, the appetites. Second degree, the mind. I'm assigning third degree to the soul. What I mean is that third degree is about opening to the depths of oneself, that deep meaning of true will that I was just talking about, that larger context which determines who we are. For that reason, it begins to touch upon the mystical. More generally, though, O.T.O provides something like a philosophical training, an ethos that supports not just mystical and magical work, but your course through life generally. One of the most important constraints we encounter in life is other people. From the moment we come into this world and until the moment we depart, we must contend with the thoughts, desires, expectations, actions, malice, kindness, and so forth from other human beings. But just as working with our own internal constraints complexifies us and increases our powers, working with others is also potentially a source of self-empowerment. O.T.O provides a community of individuals dedicated to many of the principles I just described, and our fraternal bonds with one another can be looked at as constraints which enable and increase the freedom of all. The focus of O.T.O is on human flourishing generally. Taking an interest in human flourishing for its own sake is what the ancient Greeks meant when they used the term agape. We ask all who approach us to look within themselves. Can you find within you that very same capacity for generosity, which the ancients called the highest, most divine form of love? If so, then you might be a good fit for a true brotherhood, sisterhood, and siblinghood of human beings. Whether or not you are interested in joining O.T.O, if you wish to learn more about Thelema, I suggest reading the works of Aleister Crowley. I enjoy giving summaries of Thelema as much as the next person, but there's no substitute for reading Crowley himself. What he said about Thelema tends to have a much greater scope and a much greater depth than any authors commenting on him, myself included. To that end, I have set up a website where I have included what I believe are some of the most important introductory texts. It's called Mouth of the Beast. It's completely free of charge, and is not connected in any way with OTO. It is just a service I have offered to help people start reading Crowley as quickly as possible. I'll put the link in the chat window as well. If you've gotten anything of value out of hearing this short talk, please consider donating to Horizon. Your $5 contribution helps us to continue to offer these and other events, and to maintain our temple space in Seattle, where we offer celebrations of the Gnostic Mass, initiations, original rituals, classes, and social events. We'll put links in the chat window for you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your kind attention. Love is the law, love under will. What does it mean to accept the book of the law? That is a great question. For all intents and purposes, in other words, within the context of OTO and as far as OTO is concerned, usually it just means that you accept that it exists. There's really nothing that follows from it. Personally, for me, from my point of view, I would say that it means accepting the law of Thelema as it is expressed in the book of the law. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That might be a slightly more informative way of putting it. It's very personal. We have a question. Does OTO favor masculine or feminine energy? No. I think you were asking me whether it favors one over the other. I just said no. No. The central ritual of OTO, the Gnostic Mass, both a priest and a priestess serve in it. Crowley explicitly said, in the new aeon, both the man and the woman serve the central role. So there is no favoring. From the perspective of Thelemic philosophy and how the individual is constituted, as I said, each of us is Hadit and Nuit conjoined. We have two divine parents, not just one. So we have that which propels us through the world, that allows us to go, and which is in some sense responsible for us choosing this course or another. And we also have we're also the beneficiaries of a certain gift of being, you might say, of embodiment. So it's both. Let's see, I found out about OTO from researching Masonry. Do you have many members that are Masons, or do you find that most members do not have a connection to Masonry? I would say that there are some Masons in OTO. I've met a few. I've met quite a few, actually. There does seem to be some crossover. I wouldn't say that most members have that connection, especially since OTO is, I mean, I don't know what the percentages are. It seems like it's about half male, half female. So no, I would not say most, but I would say I've encountered a fair number of them. Yes, you do see that. It seems like lots of Thelema is personal interpretation. Other than the main do what thou wilt, are there required, agreed upon maxims or principles? No, not at all. You will find that in practice, I mean, maybe to frame it a little bit differently, as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, from my perspective, there are certain creeds or beliefs that are involved in Thelema, but they are not the central focus or the center of gravity of Thelema. The point of Thelema is to awaken you to a truth about yourself and about the world and the connection between those two things. That's how I see it. So from my perspective, such agreed upon maxims or principles would be there provisionally to serve that purpose, and so they could be there. In practice, you find that people have varying beliefs on what Thelema is and what Thelema is about. That being said, O.T.O does, kind of, I said at the beginning that O.T.O does not have an interpretation of what Thelema is. There is a certain practical interpretation of Thelema in O.T.O, just insofar as we have certain rules of conduct and expectations of how you are going to treat one another in this organization. So there is that. But in general, I will say you would have, honestly, the attitude in the Thelemic community is one of hostility toward agreed upon maxims or principles, to put it bluntly. You can decide for yourself whether you think Thelemites share a lot of opinions in common or not, but there seems to me to be hostility toward that. Is magic in the O.T.O used primarily as a tool to help one discover one's will or purpose? Is that its only function, or does it have other uses? So that's kind of a large question. So it means different things at different levels of involvement in O.T.O. So the main sort of O.T.O is in possession of a single secret of magic. Okay. It is not a particular technique of magic. It is a secret of magic. So, I mean, the way that I would describe the difference is the difference between, let's say, doing a particular ritual to invoke your holy guardian angel, like let's say Liber Samac, right? Versus the general directive, inflame yourself in praying. Okay. My understanding from what I've seen and what I've been told is that the secret of magic is more like the latter than the former. Okay, if that makes sense. So, and the purpose of that magic is very general. That magic can be used to bring about some concrete state of affairs in the world. It could be used to connect to your holy guardian angel. It could be used for invocation. The way Crowley describes it, it's very, very general. Okay, it's very multi-apt that way. Now, that being said, at the lower degrees, okay, when you're coming in and going through like 0 through, perfect initiate, let's say, the man of earth, the magic is closer to what I was talking about in the presentation, which is more about learning to, it's about developing character, learning self-discipline, self-control at those different levels, okay? Building harmony and balance at each level. So that is having a balanced relationship with things like your impulses, right? Things of that nature, bodily instincts, having balance at the level of mind. Okay. If you read Magic in Theory and Practice, balance is mentioned everywhere. It's the most important thing to Crowley. And, working that at different levels. And then, like I said, also optimizing so that those different, I don't know what I'm doing with my hands here, optimizing so that those different levels are supporting one another. Okay. So that you are becoming more unified. That is a kind of magic, unifying yourself and getting yourself into that kind of internal integrity, and getting that flow between Hadid and Nuit, and really kind of taking up that stance of Rahor Kuit. That's magic. That is a kind of magic. Okay, it's a different register of magic. So, and that involves more maybe what you were asking in terms of discovering your purpose. So you have to understand, from Crowley's perspective, magic is a highly multi-apt term. Okay, it goes in all sorts of, it applies to many different, he says it from everything to getting up to get a drink of water to cursing your neighbor's cattle. So it really runs the gamut. But hopefully that at least kind of fills out what it looks like in O.T.O. It runs the gamut from developing character in a kind of like almost quasi-stoic way, all the way up to the secret of all magic, essentially, which would just imagine what that would entail. When you know how general Crowley's idea of magic is, just think about what the secret of all magic would mean. You would become the master of life itself. That's the idea. How can I find a lodge in my area? So what you would do is, are you in the United States? I'll assume you're in the United States. If you are, you would go to the United States Grand Lodge website. There you go. You would go right there to where Kellen just linked you, and you would find one. You'd find the nearest location, and hopefully it's not too far. And what you would want to do is, if you decide that you want to go, I would reach out to somebody, go to their website and see, just find whatever contact information. You should find contact information on the website and email them and say that you're interested in attending an event. Let them know. That'll be helpful to them, and it'll be helpful to you because they can, just tell you, I guess, what's expected. First time I went to Horizon, I emailed and I was like, I'm coming for the first time on this date. Is there anything I need to know before showing up? And they were like, because it's West Coast, they're like, just show up. But, depending on where you are, they could have any number of expectations, but they'll make you feel welcome, I'm sure.